Hello, everyone. Welcome. My name is Lee Roby, and I am the Vice President of ACTR. It is my distinct pleasure to invite Richard Brecht, one of the co-founders of ACTR and many-year board member, to introduce our keynote speaker, Judith Kroll.
Thanks, Lee. It's truly my honor to introduce you briefly to Dr. Judith F. Kroll, Distinguished Professor in the Department of Education at the University of California, Irvine, and one of this country's most distinguished academics, a veritable force of nature. Dr. Kroll earned her bachelor's degree in psychology from New York University and completed her master's and doctoral degrees in cognitive psychology at Brandeis University. Prior to joining the UCI, the University of California, Irvine School of Education, Judith served as faculty at Swarthmore College, Rutgers University, Mount Holyoke College, Penn State University, and the University of California, Riverside. She is a fellow, and this is quite remarkable, a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Psychological Association, the American Physiological Society, the Psychonomic Society, and the Society of Experimental Psychologists. She is one of the founding editors of the journal Bilingualism, Language and Cognition at Cambridge University Press, and one of the founding organizers of Women in Cognitive Sciences, a group supported by the National Science Foundation developed to promote an advancement of women in cognitive sciences. Dr. Kroll's research uses the tools of cognitive neuroscience to examine the way that bilinguals and language learners juggle the presence of two languages in one mind and brain. Her work, which has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and National Institutes of Health, show that bilingualism provides a tool for revealing the interplay between language and cognition that is otherwise obscure in speakers of only one language. While we all know that many adults find it difficult to acquire a second language past early childhood, her Bilingualism, Mind and Brain Lab at UCI uses behavioral and neuroscience methods to answer such research questions like, what enables adult learners to acquire a second language successfully? Why do you think she's here? Besides her research, and I'd like to stress this, Judith is a marvelous teacher, program, and community builder, as evidenced by her every Monday morning language science colloquium with researchers the world over that she manages at her Bilingualism, Mind and Brain Lab, as well as her founding and active work in building the global organization Bilingualism Matters. Also, together with colleagues at Penn State University, she is a principal investigator on a Partnership for International Research and Education grant from the National Science Foundation to develop an international research network and program of training to enable language scientists at all levels, undergraduate, graduate, and postdoctoral, to pursue research abroad on the science of language learning and bilingualism. I can't even imagine how she finds the time to be a friend and supporter of so many of us striving to improve bilingualism around the world. Finally, when I asked her what would she like to mention, what would she like me to mention here, her response was typically strategic. Nothing special to highlight other than the importance of building communities that bridge across perspectives and experiences. It's the only way we collectively will survive in the current context. What more appropriate a keynote speaker at this conference than Judith, who gives us the much needed opportunity to understand the relevance of critical cognitive neuroscience research to language learning and ultimately to our students' challenges and capabilities. It's an honor for me to call Judy a friend and a privilege to introduce her to the distinguished international audience. Over to you, Judy.
Well, this is very embarrassing. And I just want to say, Dick, thank you for this beautiful introduction. Am I muted? No. And I just also want to say that none of the things that we can accomplish in our lives do we accomplish alone. This really is part of a community. And just in being here in the brief time that I've seen all of you, it's very clear that this is very much a community. So I'm very, very honored to be here and look forward to interacting with you. I have two preliminary comments that I just want to make. One is that I am a laboratory scientist, and some people sometimes think that laboratory scientists are sometimes out of touch with reality. We have stereotypes in the culture we live in. If you've watched Back to the Future too many times, that laboratory scientists are a little bit kooky and not really in touch with either learning or culture or the community. And I'm going to try to argue today that that's not true. And in fact, many of the discoveries that we've made in the laboratory are quite congenial. And even with what I've heard about just in the time that I've been listening to the talks today. And one of my problems, and I share this with Dick, is that I'm a little bit overly enthusiastic. So I'm going to have way too much to present. And I just want to say that I am happy to be interrupted. I'm happy to share my slides. I'm happy to share papers. So I'm going to purposely go bit fast to try to give you an overview of what I see as being most relevant to the issue of language learning and what we can learn from the laboratory. My other comment is just very personal, and I'm going to make sure I'm. So this is just to say that I'm pretty sure that I'm the only person in the room who neither speaks nor understands Russian. And, but I want to tell you and share that over 100 years ago, my father and his family left a town outside of Kiev to come to the US. They spoke Russian and Yiddish. They learned to speak English, but they never spoke Russian to us. They immersed us in Yiddish as their home language and their cultural language. They would not believe what's happening in the US today. And I just want to say, as I start, that I honor their courage and grit that has enabled me to have the life that I've had and to be able to do what I've had. And I hope that we can stand together to preserve our democracy. So, traditional stories about language learning that most of us have come of age with in the linguistics classes that we've taken suggest that learning a second language past early childhood is a difficult task for adults. And we know that these are very well-worn graphs that you've seen in many different contexts. The data on the left are from Jim Flagey's lab on accentedness. The data on the right are Johnson and Newport's very well-known study on grammar. And what these data show is that people who arrive in a context past early childhood seem to have less of an ability to fully acquire aspects of the language in which they're exposed. And this story about critical periods, about sensitive periods, about early learning has really been with psychology and linguistics for a very, very long time. And what we see today is that the story is beginning to come undone. It's beginning to come apart because there's much more adult plasticity than we previously understood. And one of the contributions of the current neuroscience approaches has been to really demonstrate how that plasticity might work. So bilingualism, traditionally, especially for adult learners, has been considered a complication or a problem, something that was, complicated and special, not in a positive sense, but in a sense that was, seriously problematic, despite the fact that more people in the world are bilingual or multilingual than monolingual. And so we need to ask ourselves why we might consider bilingualism a problem. And of course, there are many reasons we can understand this in many different ways. But my characterization and caricature of this is that the traditional view was that there was a very privileged place for the first language. The native language is privileged, that you have this very neat representation of the native language, and that the second language was essentially messy, and that the traditional idea was that we wanted to ask, how could we turn this messiness into something that was as neat and privileged as the native language? So on this view, late bilinguals were considered to be special, with a very mixed language system that included this L1 that was very stable, this native language that was very stable, and what I'm calling in a very non-technical way, a funky L2. So on this view, bilinguals should be functionally monolingual in the native language. But so the native language is really just there in a very constant way. But it's the second language that's changing. So we need to pay attention to what's happening with the L2. And on this view, we would expect the L1 to transfer to the L2. And of course, there's a very long history of research on transfer, and much of that is certainly quite legitimate, but we wouldn't necessarily expect transfer from the L2 to the L1. We'd expect this to be really asymmetric in the relationship. What we've seen in the last 30 years is that there has been a tremendous upsurge of research on bilingualism that suggests profound linguistic, cognitive, and neural consequences. The data on the left are just some citations from Google Scholar for the years 2000 to 2023. And even in this 23-year period, you see this rapid rise. And what have we discovered? The argument that I'm going to make is that we have discovered that being bilingual truly changes the architecture of your brain, and it changes it largely in a positive way. And a key observation in all of this research is that brains are plastic throughout the lifespan. This is not just about childhood that provides plasticity, it's about the entire lifespan. So I'm going to argue that learning and using two languages or more creates enduring consequences for the mind and the brain, and also reflects the changes that languages undergo themselves. And so I want to ask how minds and brains are changed by learning and using two languages. And one of the changes is that I'm going to argue that the native language, or the first learned, the first acquired language, adapts to accommodate the second language. And that claim is a bit of an unusual claim in this traditional context. And I'm going to also argue that adaptation has consequences for language, but also for the consequences of bilingualism itself. So I'm going to start backwards to ask first, what are the consequences of bilingualism? And of course, in the context of this brief talk, I'm not going to be able to go into great detail, but just to give you a brief sense. And then I want to consider what it is that bilinguals do with language that might produce these consequences. And I want to emphasize something particularly to this audience, which is oriented to language and language teaching and linguistic issues, which is that very little of the research that has considered the consequences of bilingualism has actually asked what bilinguals do with language. It's focused primarily on cognition and its brain basis, but not so much on language itself. And that's what we want to do here. So just a brief timeout to say who is bilingual, because I know that across the different perspectives that study bilingualism, there are some very different views about this. I'm trained as a cognitive scientist. I take a very liberal view to this. I'm going to say anyone who actively uses two languages is bilingual in a way. So yes, there are people who differ in proficiency, in their language dominance, in how we want to characterize it. And one of the themes, and it's interesting because I think it's one of the themes in the talks that I've heard so far at this meeting, is that we need to be characterizing who people are much more deeply than we have in the past, to understand that there's tremendous variation across bilingual dual language speakers. And so I'm going to take a very broad view, and then what I'm going to do is try to be specific in any given study to be very clear who it is I'm talking about. So what are the consequences of bilingualism across the lifespan? This is like a very, very brief sampling of some of the evidence just across the lifespan from childhood to old age. So research on babies. And I assume that most of you aren't thinking about teaching Russian to babies, but babies get exposed to all sorts of things, and they get exposed to multiple languages. And what we know is that despite the mythology out there that maybe babies are going to be confused by hearing more than one language, that the result is quite the opposite. And unlike some areas of research, this is an area of research where there's really not as much controversy. People basically agree. What we see is that babies who are exposed to more than one language from the start show speech systems that are more open to all languages. And those speech systems seem the metaphor that Laura Ann Petito used was this idea of a perceptual wedge, just like you would have a actual wedge in a door to keep it open. The idea is that babies exposed to more than one language have a kind of wedge in their brain that keeps the speech system going and open in ways that facilitate learning. And I'm not going to go through the evidence for this, but there's been evidence, including, as you see in the lower right, neuroscience evidence with little babies, looking at what happens in their brains when they hear more than one language. And it turns out bilingually exposed babies are different than monolingually exposed babies. And they're different in the scope of speech sensitivity that they show. And they're also different in their ability to, the degree to which they have developed executive function areas of the brain or very early in life before their first birthday. So something very special is happening when babies are exposed to two languages from the start. What happens to young adults? This is a study by Jubin Abitalabi and colleagues in Milan, where they were simply playing a parlor game with their bilingual and monolingual participants, asking them to perform this little flanker task, this little cognitive task. So you see the arrow that's pointed in one direction or the other, and your task is simply press a button, depending on which direction the arrow is pointed. And so if you see the arrow pointed to the right, you press the right, arrow pointed to the left, you press the left. Typically, what we see is that if all the arrows, you see in this little diagram, if all the arrows are lined up all together, or if they're in different directions that are conflicting, it's like saying to someone, how do I get there? And they say, that away. Well, people get confused when you do that. And bilinguals as well as monolinguals get confused. But here's the critical finding. This is a functional magnetic resonance imaging study looking at the activity of this particular area of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex, which is known to be an area involved in conflict resolution. And what we see is, you see for the monolinguals, you see that bright yellow in the brain that's lit up. And you see for the bilinguals, the same area of the brain is being used. But do you see how it's a small little red dot? Okay, what's the argument? The argument is that bilinguals use the same area of the brain to solve the problem as monolinguals. But bilinguals require less brain activation to do it. They are more skilled. They become more efficient at resolving conflict, even in a non-linguistic task like the flanker task. And there have been many, many demonstrations like this. The consequences of bilingualism become even more dramatic over age. Aging is not kind to the brain more generally. We all know that. And what we can see is various areas of the brain that begin to sort of shrivel up and do things that we're not very happy with. We see a loss of gray matter volume. We see changes in the brain that are not good for facilitating cognitive function or language function for that matter. But there's a question we can ask about whether bilingualism protects the aging brain. And many studies, and this is actually another study by Abitalabi's lab, but many studies have shown that bilingual older adults, healthy bilingual older adults, seem to be able to hold on to their cognitive functions and to their brain structure better than monolinguals. You see, for monolinguals, this graph shows this is a function of age, and what you see is the amount of gray matter volume in this particular area of the brain is declining, and just in the way you might think if you thought, well, as you get old, your brain's basically turns into a prune. So what happens is you just have shrinkage over time. You see for the bilinguals, a lot of variation, but what you see is that for the bilinguals, things seem pretty stable. And so the claim is that bilinguals may have some protection in the way they use the two languages, may come to protect their brains more generally. And the most provocative findings of all come from evidence on dementia. Bilingualism does not protect individuals against dementia, against Alzheimer's type dementia, but bilingualism seems to affect the prevalence of the symptoms of dementia, the cognitive symptoms. And a number of studies have shown that when bilingual patients who ultimately end up being diagnosed with dementia show up in the doctor's office.
Sorry?
Yes.
No.
They are 4 to 5 years older than their monolingual counterparts. In other words, they have spent 4 to 5 years basically, compensating in some way. So somehow they are not showing the symptoms of dementia. People around them don't realize that their cognitive health has significantly declined until they actually get to the point of being diagnosed. And at that point of being diagnosed, if their brains are scanned, they are more diseased than their monolingual counterparts, which suggests that bilingualism is providing some protection against this kind of cognitive decline. Now, this is just a depiction of this in a paper from Bialystok's lab, showing that if you look at brain atrophy, and this is increasing brain atrophy on the x-axis, so what you see is that bilinguals are able to maintain their cognitive function at a higher level, even in the presence of brain atrophy, which suggests that bilingualism has created some marvelous counterpart to be able to counteract these declines. So the question we want to ask is, what causes this? What do we do with language that might actually provide these kinds of benefits? And the claim is that bilingualism creates cognitive reserve and resilience. But we don't know what bilinguals do with language that may actually produce that resilience. And so what I want to do here, and what I'm going to argue, is that we need to look at the interplay between language processes themselves and the mechanisms of cognitive control that are engaged during language processing to begin to understand these effects. And as you'll see, I'm going to focus in a way that may seem very counterintuitive from the start on the native language. And I'm going to speculate that the same dynamics that we see in language immersion of the sort that many of you are studying may actually be the same mechanisms that underlie resilience in the face of dementia. So the metaphor in this work over a long period of time has been that the bilingual is a mental juggler. What we have discovered in the laboratory is that both languages are active regardless of the requirement to use one alone. It doesn't mean people are necessarily aware of that activity. It doesn't mean you have conscious awareness that intrudes in your ability to use one language or the other. But we see evidence, and I'm not going to have time today to review it, but happy to share papers and other talks that go into that evidence, showing that there is parallel activation of the two languages. Everything comes online at the same time. So the question then is, if everything comes online, it sounds like a computational nightmare, but it's not, because what happens is bilinguals learn to sort out the interference that potentially could occur between the two languages. They learn how to juggle the two languages and the fact that the two languages sometimes converge and often conflict. And initially, the story we had about this was very kind of simple. It was that bilinguals become good jugglers. And if you're a good mental juggler, that's going to protect you from all sorts of cognitive problems. And we now know that the answer to this question is not quite so simple. It's more complex because there's a lot of variation in bilingual experience, and not all bilinguals show the same consequences. So we really need to dig in to understand what it is that bilinguals are doing with language specifically, and how the variation across bilinguals, across learners, and across contexts and environments of language use may shape these consequences. So past studies, as I said, have documented the effects of transfer, or the effect of the more dominant language on the less dominant language. And that's really not controversial anymore. Both languages are always active, and we see this very dynamic interplay. And quite counterintuitively, it does not seem to depend on what the languages are. And we can come back to this in questions, because it's a question I always get, which is that you think that linguistic distance might matter, typology might matter, and it's not that they don't matter, but that at another level, what we see is we see these interactions regardless of whether the speakers are proficient or not, regardless of whether the languages are structurally more distinct or not. We see it in Spanish and English, and Dutch and English, and Chinese and English. We also see it in American Sign Language and English, which is about as different as you might think you could get. And we still see these two languages come online together and interact. And we also see it at every level of language processing for the lexicon, the phonology, and the grammar. So I'm not going to ask so much about the effect of the L1 on the L2. I'm going to ask the opposite. I'm going to ask, how does the second language during learning, and once people become more proficient, how does the second language affect the first? So this is going to be a story about the native language and what it is that bilinguals do that change the native language. So the starting point in our story is the hypothesis that bilinguals learn to regulate their native or dominant language. And the native or dominant language changes when you learn and use a second language. I'm going to argue that those changes are dynamic, they're normal, they're natural, they are not attrition. So I think attrition exists. I'm not doubting the presence of attrition, but this is not attrition. It's not loss. It's not deficit. It's that what we see is that when the second language comes online, the second language comes to affect the first language, and the two languages come to live in the same language system together. And that process is also influenced by the demands of the environment, including the context in which the bilingual two languages are used, and by the demands and opportunities for the two languages to be used. So whether people live in social networks where they speak the same languages with the same people, by the culture in which they are embedded, this does not occur in isolation. Two bilinguals who speak the same languages, but one who speaks in a context where everyone else speaks the same two languages, is going to look very different than someone who's in a kind of functionally hostile environment where only some people will speak one of their two languages and many others don't. And so we will come back to that to consider its influence. So the idea is that the native language changes to enable fluent L2 use. And the hypothesis is that successful adult second language learners may be individuals who are able to effectively learn to regulate the native language, to accommodate the second language, and to negotiate the competition that potentially occurs across the two languages. In that process, and this is a word again, this is my making this word up, and it's fortunately or unfortunately, it's now become used in the literature in ways that kind of scare me. But I said once, and then it sort of took, that the L1 may take a hit, and that sounds terrible. But what I mean by that is I mean that there may be processing costs that initially slow the L1 down when you're learning a L2, may make the native language performance more error prone, essentially may open the native language to the second language. And so it's a process that may have positive outcomes, but that may initially produce some changes that seem as if they may be less than ideal when you think about it. So the idea is that acquiring regulation skills in the native language, which is going to draw on cognition and cognitive resources, may be at least somewhat responsible for some of these consequences that we've seen that are associated with bilingualism. So where did this story start? Okay, sometimes you go back and you look at things that you've discovered when you didn't fully understand what they meant when you first saw them. This is a study that we did more than 20 years ago, really simple study just on learners. We did a study, this was when I was at Penn State, and we were studying students who were learning Spanish in the classroom and students who were learning French. And we just had them name words that they saw. The word would be presented on the screen and they would just have to name it, or they say a word and they have to translate it. And we compared their performance to the performance of their teaching assistants, who were typically graduate students who were much more proficient than they were in the second language, also native speakers of English, but more proficient, had had immersion experience and were simply more advanced. And we found something that was very curious. So what's shown in this plot is the language, whether L1 or L2, and just the time it took them to name the word. People can name a word very quickly, less than a second. And what you see for the L2 is it's not that surprising. The purple are the learners and the black are the more proficient TAs. And the people who are just learning are slower to name words in L2. So that's nothing really to write home about. What's interesting is that when you look at the L1, which is English, for all these people are native English speakers, the learners are slower to speak English than their more advanced teaching assistants. And so we looked at this and we thought, that's strange. Could be because maybe they're just being more cautious because they know they sometimes have to speak L2. Maybe it's that learners are more of a mixed group cognitively than the teaching assistants, because not everybody goes on to become proficient. We did a whole variety of tests to try to figure this out. And in the end, it looked to us to be a reflection of learning, that something was going on during learning that was simply slowing down the first language while the second language was being learned. And the later evidence that I'm going to present is consistent with that interpretation. We then, many years later, decided to do a brain study to ask the question of what happens in learners' brains when they're first learning, in this case, Spanish. These were students at Penn State who were native English speakers, and Penn State is in a very monolingual English environment in the US. And so they get this Spanish in the classroom. They don't have lots of opportunity outside the classroom to speak Spanish. And what we did is we simply did an electrophysiology experiment where they have their brain waves are being tracked in a cap that looks something like this person who's on the lower right. And what they had to do is they saw words in English, which was their native language. And all they had to do was simply decide whether this string of letters was a real word in English. So you see a word like tomato and you say, yes, you'd hit a key, yes. You see a word like book, you'd say yes. And then you'd see a bunch of other letter strings that were not real words in English. Critically, some of the words in English were cognates with Spanish, like tomato and tomate. Some of the words in English were not, like book and libro. And the question we had is, if you're just learning Spanish, would it come to affect your English? And these were learners, and in learners at a kind of beginning intermediate level in this Penn State context were not proficient speakers of Spanish. You look at their behavioral responses, how quickly they can press the button. Nothing. They look just like monolinguals. You would just hang it up and go home looking at their behavioral data. Then you look at their brain activity, and I'm not having time today to go into all the gory detail, but basically what you find, what we're looking at in these plots is the difference between responding to cognates or non-cognates. And just remember, this is English, their native language. What do you see for the monolinguals? Monolinguals don't know what the difference between a cognate or non-cognate is, doesn't make any difference. The beginning learners are beginning to show a difference, but by the time they're intermediate learners, which is only a couple semesters out, their brains are registering a difference. Now, remember, behaviorally, they don't show a difference, but their brains are beginning to outpace behavior in showing that their English is being affected by the Spanish they're learning. They don't know that that's happening, but it's happening and coming online almost right away. So being bilingual is not just about acquiring using the L2, it's also about how the L1 changes. And much of the work that we've done in the time since then has been to try to ask the question, how can we investigate this change? And what are the contexts in which the native language actually takes a hit? One of them is during language immersion. And another is when we take immersion into the laboratory and try to simulate it by manipulating the conditions of spoken production. So in one study that was conducted and it was published in 2009, Jared Link was the first author. And he went to Salamanca, Spain, where he himself had spent a semester abroad as an undergraduate and performed a set of psycholinguistic experiments with immersed learners. So these were native English speakers who were studying, they were intermediate students of Spanish. None of them was highly proficient. They were proficient enough to be eligible to go abroad. And then he compared their performance with classroom learners at the same level. And the main result in this study, and I'll show you the data in a second, is that their native language, the L1, their English, was suppressed when they were in Salamanca. One of the tasks he used was a semantic verbal fluency task. And this is a task where I have the picture here just for illustration, but it's not what people see. So I tell you fruit, and you just have to name as many fruits as you can think of in 30 seconds, either in English or in Spanish. And as you might expect, these people are intermediate learners of Spanish. They're native English speakers. They produce much more in English than in Spanish. That's no big deal. Notice that in Spanish, the people in Salamanca produce more Spanish than the people who are in the classroom, and that's a good thing. It means being immersed helps you. But the critical result in this study is on the left. The critical result is for the L1. When they produce in English, their native language, the immersed participants produce less English than the classroom learners. So being in this environment seems to sit on their English. And you might say, well, that's not so surprising because they're speaking Spanish more. And what we did is we then tracked their production of English over the course of the whole experiment, and they were suppressed throughout. So the point is that it's not just beginning to speak English and then catching up. I mean, when they do go home and they do eventually recover. But what we see is we see this dynamic where the English has been effectively down-regulated to enable them to use their Spanish. So they are suppressing their L1 while they're living in the L2 context. We then ask the question, can we simulate this in the laboratory? So can we come up with an experiment in the laboratory that will make this happen? And we've done this now in many experiments where what we do is we ask our bilingual participants to speak the L1 after they've been speaking the L2 for a while. So we vary the order in which they speak. We say either speak the L1 for a while, then speak the L2, or vice versa. And this is an example of a study that was done with Japanese participants who were highly proficient in English. They were international students at Penn State. They're living in the US, but they were highly dominant in Japanese as their L1. And what you can see here is they rate themselves on a 7-point scale, higher in Japanese than in English. And you do one of these verbal fluency tests and see how many words can you produce in Japanese versus in English. They can produce more in Japanese. They're Japanese dominant, which makes sense. Now what we do is we play this little game with them. And we either have some people speak the L1 before the L2, and we do that by having them name pictures in each language, or name in the L2 first and then the L1. When they name in the L1 first, we see exactly what we would expect based on their dominance. They are faster to provide the name of a picture in Japanese than in English. So Japanese is the black bar and English is the red bar. And that's what you'd expect for people who are dominant in Japanese. What happens, though, when they have to name Japanese after they named English? Now they are slower. Not only are they slower than when they named it in the other order, but they are slower than the time it takes them to, than the time it takes them to name English. They become slower to name in their dominant language when they have just had to speak the non-dominant language. And we and others have now replicated this finding many, many times. There is a reversal of their dominance. The native language is taking a hit when the second language has to be spoken and the first language needs to be controlled. We've done this with brain imaging. I'm not going to go into the details today, but we've done it with brain imaging, same thing. We always show it's L1 that's really taking the hit, that's showing the greater activity when we force people either to mix languages or when we force them to name in the L1 after they've spoken the L2. We see it in studies where they're brief exposures. Is it a deficit? No, it's the ordinary dynamics of bilingualism that enables speakers to use two languages actively in different situations. Is it simple inhibition of the native language? We don't think so. We used to think so. We don't think so anymore. We think that what's happening is that there is an up and down regulation of the two languages, depending on the context, depending upon who they're speaking with, and that it's the more dominant language, which is typically the L1, that is having to be regulated to enable the use of the L2. And we see these effects appear early in learning, and we think that they reflect the dynamic changes that are required to become a proficient bilingual. So our hypothesis is that the differences in the ability to regulate the L1 may be critical in predicting language learning success and also in cognitive outcomes. There is a long literature, and again, I can't go into detail on this today, but in the literature more generally, in cognitive psychology, in learning and memory, we see that there are sometimes desirable difficulties in learning, sometimes conditions of learning that slow you down, that require that you understand the conceptual basis of something, that allow you to learn from errors, are going to produce more stable learning outcomes, even though they may appear to be a hit or a deficit initially when they occur. And so we conducted a study where we try to examine this directly by looking at word learning. And this is a study that was headed by Carrie Bogalski, who was a graduate student at Penn State at the time. And what we did is we had bilingual participants and monolingual participants learn a set of 60 Dutch words. And you might say, why Dutch? And in State College for English-Spanish bilinguals and for English monolinguals, we were able to sample individuals who had no prior experience with Dutch or German. So the Dutch words were equally novel for both groups. And what we did is we did an experiment where they learned these Dutch words by associating them to English, which was their native language. So in the study task, you'd see a Dutch word, and then you'd be told the name of it in English. And so I show you the word fiets, which means bike in Dutch. And all you have to do is look at fiets for 2 seconds, and then you get the word bike, and then just say bike. You don't even have to learn the phonology associated with Dutch. You just say the word bike. And then what we do is we look at how long people take to say bike. And we found something extraordinary. We thought we made a mistake in our statistics program, because look at the data. The green are English, Spanish bilinguals, and the gray are English monolinguals. Do you see how much slower the green is than the gray? The bilinguals are really, really slow. They're taking like 500 milliseconds, with like half a second longer to name these words in English. They're all native English speakers. They're taking half a second longer to name the words in English than the monolinguals. And we did this over different sessions, and we still found this effect. And we thought we made a mistake. We must have programmed this incorrectly. We went back and looked at it. And did we make a mistake? No, we didn't. The bilinguals were slower than the monolinguals in performing this very simple paired associate learning task. What happened at test? At test, we then give them a task where they have to recognize whether it's a Dutch word that's a real Dutch word or not. It turns out the bilinguals are advantaged in learning relative to the monolinguals. So here, they are more sensitive. The green bars are higher than the gray bars. And so what we see is that there's some relationship between the time that the bilinguals spend studying and their performance at test. And so one, you have to be very critical of yourself. And so we thought, maybe those bilinguals are just slow people. Maybe they're just slow. Maybe we find this advantage later because the bilinguals just take a long time. So that's possible. It's also possible that this is really a learning strategy that they've adopted. And of course, that's the more interesting alternative. So we had a control task where we had them look at a picture and just name it. So you see the picture and you just say, for example, apple. And when we compare the bilinguals and monolinguals, we find they are exactly the same to do this in English. So the point is that the bilinguals are not slow. And they're only slow when they're attempting to learn new information. It's a learning strategy. It's not about speaking. So the point here is that they are very slow when they're studying new words, but they're better at later recognizing the words than the monolinguals. Why? The argument we made was that they are learning to regulate the native language, and that regulation has a cost associated with it. It has a temporary processing cost that produces this hit, but it is only really a desirable difficulty. In other words, they are adopting a strategy that looks like it's hurting them, but in the end, it's actually helping them. Where else do we see these inhibitory effects or absence of them? Well, we go back to that slide I showed you earlier of the idea that bilingualism may delay the onset of the symptoms of dementia. There are a couple of studies, only a couple, that look at what happens when bilinguals actually present with dementia. And it turns out what those studies show is that these bilingual patients can no longer speak L2. Why? The hypothesis is that they can no longer speak L2 because they can no longer regulate or inhibit their L1. If you lose your inhibitory control skills, then at that point, and if you need those inhibitory control skills and the regulation to be able to speak your L2, then the L2 is going to suffer at that point. And that's exactly what's seen. And we think this is a clue about what underlies this source of cognitive resilience that we see in bilinguals. I just want to say I'm watching the time, and I know that I'm gonna try to see if I can go through this final part of the talk quickly, but I also think that I know, Dick, that you did speak for a few minutes, so I get to take those minutes back. Or just, and if there's a point where you need me to stop, you guys can tell me. Okay, so a claim I want to make is that the native language is not the Rock of Gibraltar, that the L2 has persistent effects on the L1 for learners and for highly proficient bilinguals, that these cross-language dynamics come to change the native language. What's interesting in the brain imaging studies, they sit in the two languages, sit in the same place in the brain. It's not a different place in the brain that supports the neural, that provides the neural support for the two languages. They are in the same place. And what all of this suggests is that a monolingual native speaker model may not really be the right goal of adult L2 learning. The L2 learner needs to become a bilingual speaker of the L1, not a monolingual speaker. And learners adapt to these conditions of the environment that also produce demands that influence the way this regulatory process occurs. So some bilinguals code switch, some bilinguals don't code switch. Some bilinguals use two languages that are more similar, other bilinguals use two languages that are different, so the level of competition may vary. And that variation may influence the kind of consequences that we see. So we want to ask the question about what influences these effects. So we've already looked at immersion a little bit, but we want to try to characterize more richly the linguistic, social, and cultural context of language use that make demands on speakers to differentially engage cognitive resources and that we think may ultimately shape the consequences of bilingualism. And we think that the key, and this is where I think there has been a real convergence across the psycholinguistic approaches and the sociolinguistic approaches and learning approaches, is that we all have come to see that we need to take into account the social context to understand how these things work. And so I'm very, very quickly just going to skim through this final part of the talk to consider what these different contexts might look like. We can consider what happens when bilinguals code switch with one another. We can consider the social networks and language decision-making that gets made. We've already talked a little bit about language immersion and how that affects things. And then we can talk about the linguistic diversity of the environment itself. So code switching. And code switching is interesting because I think in the world out there, code switching is probably one of the least understood phenomena in terms of, generating mythology where people think, oh, people code switch for reasons that are completely wrong. That code switching is not a deficit. Code switching is a finely tuned, it's like an athletic skill. And my metaphor for this is a tango, that bilinguals who code switch learn to do a kind of linguistic tango with one another. They learn to align with one another. They learn to be sensitive to the cues in what's coming up. We know very little about how the richness of the linguistic or cultural context affects that tuning to one another, but we've come to see that this is absolutely a sophisticated tuning mechanism, and not anything related to, oh, I don't know the grammar or words. I mean, that happens sometimes, but that is not the characterization of code switching that is now prevalent in this recent work. I'll give you one example from our lab, from work from Melinda Fricke, who's now on the faculty in linguistics at the University of Pittsburgh. And this is based upon a model of alignment, arguing that bilingual speakers and listeners come to predict what each other are going to do. They come to tune to one another to predict what happens in code switch speech. And what Melinda did is, for Spanish-English bilinguals, she used corpus data to analyze the presence of switches and their phonetic properties. And what she found is that speech rate slows down prior to a code switch. So English becomes more Spanish-like, and bilingual listeners use that subtle information to predict an upcoming switch. And again, I can't go into all the experimental gory details here today because there's not time. But the study shows that there is very fine sensitivity to people say things that you may not even, but the naked ear may not even be sensitive to the phonetic differences, but those phonetic differences function to cue listeners that a code switch is coming up. And all of that suggests, again, that they're dancing with one another, that they are learning to pay attention to critical information that guides language processing. But not everybody code switches. bilinguals live in different contexts. And those contexts may determine how easy or hard it is to recruit the cognitive resources necessary to use both languages. And in a study that Annie Beatty Martinez was the lead author on, and this was published in 2020, Annie was a graduate student at Penn State who is now on the faculty at UCSD in cognitive science. And what she did is she looked at Spanish-English bilinguals who lived in 3 locations. They were all highly proficient Spanish-English bilinguals. They lived either in Granada, Spain, where they tended to use the 2 languages separately, or in San Juan, Puerto Rico, where they used the 2 languages opportunistically and pretty much could speak either language to everyone they spoke with, and they code switched a lot. In Granada, they don't code switch very much. Or in State College, Pennsylvania, where Spanish speakers were immersed in English in an environment where there aren't that many. You can't rely on there being Spanish speakers in State College with whom you can engage. And so what she did is she did a very, very simple study. She assessed domain general cognitive control. And again, I don't have time to go into the detail, but I'm happy to follow up on it. Asking the question of using a cognitive task called the AXCPT, which is a way of asking, to what extent do we anticipate what's coming up, and to what extent do we predict, and to what extent do we wait for something to happen and then react to it reactively? And she asked the question, do these different predictive or reactive processes occur differently in these different environments when bilinguals are using the 2 languages? I'm not going to show the task here. And basically what she found the most interesting results in State College, Pennsylvania. When bilinguals cannot reliably depend on speaking Spanish or who speaks Spanish, they have to be monitoring the environment to really know who their interlocutors are and who they can speak Spanish with. If they are highly proactive, predicting what's going on, monitoring things actively, then what happens is that they can maintain their Spanish in this essentially hostile environment. So they speak English, but they also can speak Spanish. They can be more accurate in speaking Spanish if they can engage in this proactive control mechanism that enables them to keep the 2 languages active simultaneously. And what's interesting is that the patterns for these 3 groups in 3 places were different. So in past research, they would have been aggregated into a single group. We would have said these are just Spanish English bilinguals who have a high level of proficiency. Well, this shows proficiency is not enough. Proficiency is important, but it's not enough. And what we see is that the environment is going to affect the way these cognitive resources are drawn to be able to engage the 2 languages. And we see this happening over and over again. What happens during language immersion? Well, our hypothesis about immersion is that, yes, during immersion, people are getting more L2, very clear. In L2 immersion, they're getting much more L2. Their frequency of the L2 is higher than it is when they're in their L1 environment. But there's more than that. What's happening during immersion is that the environment itself is training them. This was a study done with Mandarin English bilinguals in 2 places, in 2 locations, in Beijing, China, and in State College, Pennsylvania. And Haiyang Zhang is a lead author on this paper. And what she did is she trained bilinguals in Beijing on language switching, just switch back and forth between the 2 languages using a picture naming paradigm, very simple. And so she took these bilinguals in China who were very dominant in Mandarin as their native language, and she made them switch between Mandarin and English, and she had them do it for 10 days in a row. And what she did is she first gave them this cognitive control task, this AXCPT cognitive control task to look at predictive processing. And she did it before they started the training, and she did it after. And what happens in China? What happened in China is that if they did this switching for 10 days, their proactive control scores increased when they were then tested at the end of the study. So there's something about having to switch between the two languages that's really tuning these cognitive mechanisms. She then came to the US and replicated the study. Didn't work. There was no effective training. In the US, she gave them training and she gave them this cognitive task before and after. Experiment failed. And then what happened? Then we realized the experiment didn't fail at all. What happened? The people in the US, Mandarin speakers in the US, already had proactive control over the roof. What happened? By living in State College, Pennsylvania, where English is the norm, they had to be actively monitoring the environment to use Mandarin with the fewer Mandarin speakers who were available. And they were already showing very high proactive control relative to the people in China. And these were very similar groups of Mandarin English speakers, just one was studying abroad and one wasn't. And when we look at their language performance in lexical production, the people who are immersed in the US who show this big proactive control are also really, really inhibiting their Mandarin. So they have learned how to inhibit the Mandarin to use English. The active requirement of up and down regulating their Mandarin to use English has in fact affected their minds and brain. And so they have now gotten to a moment where they are trained. They're trained not by the experiment, they're trained by the immersion experience itself. And so the immersion experience has essentially imposed this training regime on them that has created regulation. Okay, are these regulatory effects restricted to the lexicon, which is what I've primarily focused on? No. And again, I don't have time to go into all the evidence today, but there's beautiful evidence suggesting that we see it at the sentential level. We see it at the level of the phonology. This is an example of a beautiful study, not from our lab, from Edith Kahn's lab at University of Florida. This is with habitual code switchers who were doing a comprehension task. They were looking at a computer screen, reading sentences in Spanish and English that were either code switch sentences or not. And you get a typical pattern of showing whether or not habitual code switchers in general tend not to show costs when there are habitual switches. If there are switches that are very commonly used, it's usually no problem to process them. You only get a cost if you see something that's a rare switch. What they did in this study was so clever. They simply varied whether or not the other person sitting in the room with them was also a Spanish-English bilingual or a monolingual speaker of English. And they didn't actively talk to the person during the experiment itself. They were just doing this. It was actually an EEG study where they were wired up and they were reading these sentences. It turns out they show less of a code switching cost when they're sitting there with another bilingual. This is a social phenomenon. So if they have a potential code switching partner, they don't show a cost. If they're sitting there with a monolingual speaker with whom they can't code switch, they do show a cost. So this is not just about, it's not just about the, whether or not it's your own skill or your own level of experience. It's about the context in which you're doing it. Finally, and then I will promise that I will finish up quickly. Final example is a study that was complete serendipity. This is a study where I moved from Pennsylvania to California, and one of my graduate students at the time, Kinsey Bice, was in the middle of her dissertation, and she moved with me in very, very generous, good spirit. When I said I'm moving my faculty position, she said, I'm coming. And she had collected half her data in Pennsylvania and then half her data in California. And what she did, and again, I can't go into gory detail here, she taught people Finnish vowel harmony. They were either native English speakers who were monolingual, or they were Spanish-English bilinguals. And her interest in this study was really whether or not bilinguals are better at learning construction that grammatically that they don't have in their in either of their languages. But here's the main takeaway. The main result in the experiment that was of greatest interest was for the monolinguals. The monolinguals who lived in California showed generalization in their brains of the rule for Finnish vowel harmony. The monolinguals in Pennsylvania did not. And if anything, the monolinguals in Pennsylvania were higher SES. They were more advantaged in some ways. So the point is that what we found, and we have to be very careful about it because it was not why the study was done, but our speculation is that monolingual brains in diverse places, even if you don't speak the languages to which you're exposed, may benefit from that exposure. It changes the way your brain is tuned. So, where we're going, most of the research that has looked at the cognitive consequences of bilingualism, as I said, has looked at cognition and not looked at language, and not looked at the interactional context in which language is being used and the social variation in which language is being used. And so our work now is really focused very much on both what the conditions are that reveal this plasticity of learning and language over the lifespan. We want to know what aspects of early life language experience endure. One of the things that's interesting with I heard a number of different talks today on heritage learners. One of the things about the heritage learners, at least in Southern California, is virtually all of them were language brokers as children. They translated for their caregivers, and we are now very actively studying the consequences of that translation experience, that early life language experience for their experience as young adults. And of course, living in a linguistically and culturally diverse environment is important. So some people argue that these consequences of bilingualism have been overstated. In psychology, there's been a great deal of controversy about this. And we've argued that the reason there's controversy is that there hasn't been adequate characterization of who the bilinguals are and understanding all of these other factors. And we think that these consequences may vary dramatically for proficient bilinguals, depending on the context in which they live, and even for monolinguals, depending upon the context in which they live and use their languages. So on the science, we would know none of this if we just studied monolinguals. We think we need to really seek much deeper and richer characterization of language experience, and that it's not just about proficiency. And on the education and on learning, we think the implication is that the native language model and having that as the target is potentially wrong from the perspective that there's not a single target, that when two languages come in contact, they change themselves and they change each other. So we need to, and we're not going to have time today to talk about this, but we need to counter the English-only politics in the US, because that is a very, very serious concern. And I just want to thank all of my wonderful lab and collaborators and many, many visitors that we've had over a period of time who have made extraordinary contributions to this work, and invite you to visit us in Southern California, perhaps in the wintertime, or whenever it suits you. But we are very welcome to having visitors and to interacting with people across many different perspectives. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Judy. That was wonderful. And I encourage all of my colleagues to take up some of this reading and try to interpret some of this, bring some of this into their classrooms, and that'll be a great discussion. Unfortunately, we don't have time to go into that discussion now, but I can't stop thinking about all the things you said, and I'm sure my colleagues agree with you. So thanks, Judy, so much for joining us. Lee, turning over to you.
Yes, that was absolutely fascinating. It broke so many of the myths that I've considered for so long. I wish we did have time for conversation. Unfortunately, we don't. Our next session starts in 7 minutes. But it was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.